Hello class, I hope you're doing well. Today we are going to learn about Chapter 15, Section 1, Tensions Rise Between North and South. So we are going to start just looking at the differences between the North and the South. We'll start with money, okay, and their economy. The North invests their money into factories, and their economy is based on commerce and industry. The South, on the other hand, is more of an agricultural economy, and they invest their money in slaves and land, and mainly to grow cotton. The residents, people in the North, you have a lot of immigrants who are coming into the U.S. to work the factories, so you have a diverse North. In the South, you have plantation owners, you have poor whites, and you have slaves. 1/3 of the population were actually slaves. And something else I want to point out, the people who lived in the South, only 15% of them actually owned slaves. So the plantation owners who lived there were extremely wealthy, yet there were few of them. Okay, but they made most of the decisions about what would happen in the South in their government. So that brings us to slavery and territorial expansion. After the war with Mexico, the United States has this new land. And David Wilmot, actually from Pennsylvania, a fellow Pennsylvanian, he came up with the Wilmot Proviso, saying that any new territory that we acquire from Mexico will be slave-free. We are not going to expand slavery to those areas. Well, it passed through the House of Representatives, but when it got to the Senate, the South nixed it. And they said no, because they relied on their slaves for the economy and for their money, and so they struck it down. Now, even though the Wilmot Proviso was struck down, that led to the Free Soil Party. Now, something that's very interesting about the Free Soil Party is that they were completely against slavery. But it was not because of moral issues. Unfortunately, a lot of the people in this party were racist, and they did not want slavery to extend across the U.S., but they also didn't want people from African American people to move into their land as well. So they stood for free soil, free land, because something about the plantations, the cotton plantations, it eroded the soil. And so there was tension because the Free Soil Party and people did not want their land taken over by these wealthy plantation owners who were just going to eat up the soil because the cotton destroys it. We come to the Compromise of 1850. What do we do about California? We have the California Gold Rush, and a lot of people are moving into this area. And enough people were there that you could apply for statehood. The problem is, though, there's no other state that's ready to enter. And if California enters as a free state, that will upset the balance of powers between the free states and the North states. They were even. California wants to come in as a free state, and the South doesn't like that because that means they're going to lose their control, and their edge in Congress. So Stephen A. Douglas comes in with a plan, and he pushes, it wasn't his plan, but he pushed for compromise. And this is what he said. There was so much bickering, petty arguing between the two sides. He really pushed for this, and finally, it did go through. So what the North got out of it was that California would be a free state. Also, the slave trade would be abolished in Washington, D.C. I want to make this clear. It was not slavery abolished in Washington, D.C., but the slave trade. Okay, so the buying and selling of slaves, there were still slaves in D.C. though. What did the South get out of it? New Mexico and Utah, they would decide on the slavery issue by using popular sovereignty. The people who lived in that area, they would vote if they wanted slaves or they did not want slavery in their land. And it also passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the idea of the Compromise of 1850 is to smooth things over, but it actually made things worse. This Fugitive Slave Act, it increased tension. It requires Northerners to help capture runaway slaves. And if they didn't, they could face penalties. They could face jail time, a $1,000 fee, if they did not help capture these runaway slaves. It allowed slave catchers to roam the North. And unfortunately, sometimes these slave catchers would come to the North and capture free African Americans. People who were never slaves in their whole entire life, capture them and claim, they were my slave, and take them down south and then force them into slavery. The reaction? The people in the North were absolutely outraged, and it moved a lot of people towards abolition. They thought, we need to get rid of this slavery. And Harriet Beecher Stowe writes her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she reveals the truth about slavery and what was happening and how people could have their children torn from them and then sold somewhere that they'd never see their family again. I could not imagine, going through that and living that way and not knowing if you'd be torn from your family. Uncle Tom's Cabin was translated into 20 different languages. It was around the world. It was one of the most popular books of the time. The South said, well, that's not true. That's not really what happens. And people in the North said, are you serious? This is what happens down there? And again, it moved people towards the abolition movement, that they wanted to abolish slavery. That brings us to violence erupts. Senator Douglas drafts a bill to organize the Nebraska Territory. With the gold rush in California, you have people had this vision in the U.S. to have a transcontinental railroad. They wanted to put a railroad across the United States. Now, Senator Douglas is from Illinois, and he wants to make sure that the train goes through his state. So he knows in order to do that, the Nebraska Territory would have to be organized. So what he calls for is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now what this would do, it would split the Nebraska Territory into Nebraska and Kansas. And again, they would use popular sovereignty to decide if it was going to be a free or a slave state. So the people who lived there got to decide, are we going to allow slavery or are we banning it? Now, here's the thing. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroys the Missouri Compromise from 1820, which says we are not letting slavery above this line. Well, with popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they're saying every state can decide. So what happens? In Kansas, when it's time to elect their officials for their territorial government, you have pro-slavery people from Missouri rushing into Kansas because they want to vote for it to be a slave state. The thing is, they weren't even registered voters. They voted illegally. You had about 5,000 people who were pro-slavery go into Kansas and cast their ballot. Yes, we want slavery in this land. But they were illegal votes. Still, it went through, and it was said to be a slave state. Now you have another branch, though, people who are against slavery come in, and they form their own government and say, no, this is what the people want. We don't want slavery here. But the U.S. government recognizes the pro-slavery government. Well, pro-slavery people sack the town of Lawrence. John Brown gets a bunch of people together, and he ends up murdering pro-slavery neighbors. So that's where the violence starts. People hear about this, they arm themselves with guns. Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother is a reverend, actually, Reverend Beecher, and his church uses money to ship guns to anti-slavery people in Kansas. And they're called Beecher Bibles because supposedly on the box with the guns were in, they were written on, it said books, instead of guns. But they actually shipped guns to arm the people in Kansas. So civil war breaks out in Kansas over the issue of slavery. Then we have violence in Congress. Senator Sumner was speaking out against bleeding Kansas, which it was called because of the blood and the Civil War that was happening there. And he insults the Southern Senator Butler. Wow. Senator Butler's nephew, who was a congressman, Congressman Brooks, hears about this, and it doesn't go over very well. He actually attacks Senator Sumner as he's sitting at his desk with his cane, beats him over the head, makes him unconscious. He has to go to the hospital. He cannot come back to Congress until like 3 years later. So how do you think people reacted over this? The North was outraged, and they cried, "Bleeding Kansas, bleeding Sumner," just to rally the people against this pro-slavery movement. The South actually supported Congressman Brooks. While Congressman Brooks was beating Senator Sumner, he broke his cane. You had some merchants got together and bought Congressman Brooks a cane, a new cane, and had inscribed in the cane, "Hit him again!" And they gave that to him as a gift. So you will see how the rising, the tension over slavery escalated into violence. What comes out of this violence? You have a new political party, the Republican Party, who stands up, and their battle cry, and what they're saying is, against slavery, remember, bleeding Kansas, bleeding Sumner, we're going to do something about this. All right, thank you so much for tuning in and watching.